I want to talk about the city I've adopted as my home, which is London, and really talk about it as a project which is to do with what it looks like, what it feels like to live in the city, and most importantly, how it changes. And I'm calling it retrofitting because that's what we do, particularly in the global north with cities. We don't create new cities, we actually fix them, or often get it wrong. And I just reminded that mainly, Olympics are a fantastic opportunity to fuck up cities rather than to get them right. Now, the event lasts for 2 weeks, so it's not a big deal in many ways. It costs a lot of money. And what we did in London was really try and turn what is a closed event, an expensive event, a sponsored event, into actually something which becomes a piece of city. This is really the theme that I want to talk about. And political leadership is very important. You can't do any of this if you're a good architect or a good planner, whether you have a lot of money and good intentions. You need to have political leadership at all levels connect with that. I know that speakers today will talk a lot about that. And there's a context to this. This is London, an aerial view of London. The context is a physical one, that London is moving east. London today is never been so big. Never in its history, which is rare in European cities or a city in the global north. It's 8.641 million people. Interestingly, it's continuing to grow. It's going to become 10 million people. That means a little bit bigger than New York City, obviously not as big as some other cities in the global south, Asia, or elsewhere. But for a European city, it's incredibly intense. This is what we think of London in many ways. But this is another reality, and that's connecting these two is what I want to talk to you about. Now, as a member of the London School of Economics, as a social scientist, I couldn't resist showing you some very detailed work that we've done at the school. But, every city has the good and the bad side, and our experience of it is very important. So the question is, can you plan an event to make something, can you change this? Can you actually begin to rethink the city? This is a more serious version of the same diagram. In red is where you see people mainly on the right-hand side of this map, over there. In red is where people are more deprived, less educated, live less long than elsewhere. In green, which is mainly the periphery of the city and parts of West London, it's exactly the opposite. High education, better diet, and longer life expectancies. Think of every city. Hamburg will have exactly the same sort of difference, but geographically differently described. That's what I want to come to. Just take this one statistic. If you take the underground in London from West London to East London, this is where the Olympics, I'll come to in a moment, was held, you lose, as a man, 1 year of life expectancy. 1 year of life expectancy. In my city today. That's the same difference as Ho Chi Minh City and Hong Kong, or between Buenos Aires and Quito, in one city, one of the most advanced, most expensive cities in the world, with healthcare, etc. So the project of the Olympics becomes about this. It's about actually trying to connect, as many of us who've worked together on this want to link the physical and the social. How can you actually use design, infrastructure to actually rebalance a city which has become imbalanced? Why do we need an Olympics? This was a big debate. I know it's happening here. There are pros and cons. The main reason London went for it in the end was to accommodate growth. We're getting bigger. So how do you manage that growth? As I say, you can make it, do it well, or you can do it badly. Ultimately, for those of us who was involved, I was one of the advisors of 2 mayors and have survived, more or less, it was to actually try and address this big issue, which is to rebalance, as I say, the city, to resolve these enduring social and spatial inequalities. But as Ken Livingstone, the first mayor I worked for, said, it wasn't very clever to say because he didn't get re-elected, but there we go. He said it was a good excuse, and it was a fantastic term, to actually get a lot of central government funding channeled into a city. A big question here, which we'll come back to. We won the games unexpectedly. Apparently, I'm told that we beat Paris only because the Greek member pressed the wrong button, and because Chirac had offended the Scandinavians so much by saying that Finnish food was disgusting that they voted for London. Well, that's how you win. So we won the games, and we immediately made a decision collectively to, yes, spread it around the city, but mainly concentrate all the new stuff, and I'll come to that in a second. So we won with this mayor, even though he looks gloomy, but socialists look gloomy. And this guy then sort of took it over. And it's interesting there that you get two very extremely different sort of politicians who've carried the flag, literally, taken this project and tried to realize it in London. Now, London, as Hamburg will, if you win the Olympics here, have the world stage on you. And we had to look around. And I'm not putting this up just because I'm here and wanting to be nice to your audience. There are a number of people who know I use this slide all the time. But the way that the old and the new have been reconnected at Hafen City is actually quite interesting. And it's very important that I think this project continues in your bid for the Olympics. You can look at good examples, but you can also, we're lucky enough to have bad examples to look at. We, 30, 40 years ago, under Remember Mrs. Thatcher, decided to do something about the decaying docklands in the east of London. This is what we did. We created Canary Wharf, which is there, 100,000 high-value jobs. Nothing wrong with that. Everything that's wrong about it you see in this slide. It's an island of wealth in a sea of deprivation. This is in the middle of the red part of the map. It hasn't really changed that dynamic. And in a way, when you have models, and I don't want to be tough on the Greeks today, particularly today, poor guys, but you know, one way of doing games is to invest in infrastructure, which then only after a few years becomes completely redundant. We had a sort of the perfect lesson, the perfect model to avoid that. So it was pretty simple when it came to choose where should the games go. They should go in East London in the best connected public transport hub that exists in that part of the city. It's actually a very large piece of city, and that phrase, piece of city, is what I want you to share with me. In fact, you know, any city changes not just because of public sort of investment, but by also benefiting those who invest in terms of private capital. And it's fascinating that only about 2 or 3 years before the Games was awarded, or London decided to bid, that a private developer made a major development proposal to build a sort of new Canary Wharf there. So there was a piggybacking between private capital and public money. This is the amount of funding that the government put in. Now, we heard from other speakers today, you know, figures like X billion sound a lot, right? But think of the banks that we had to ask to be saved without anyone actually asking us. And the main question here is, when you come to make a judgment, and I'll end with this, how much money is this worth over how long a time? If you measure it over 2 weeks, it clearly isn't worth it. If you measure it over 30 years, then it is. And this notion that the British politicians used, which was really, I think, quite interesting, was the one of convergence. That I showed you that there are different life chances, effectively, across London. I stress, in any city they're like that. And the plan here was, could you invest infrastructure, education, health, parks, sports facilities, housing, in an area of London which suffered from under sort of provision, so that in 20 years, in 30 years, kids born in East London would have the same life chances, a convergence of opportunity. That's a big ask, you could say. And many people are skeptical that design or physical infrastructure is part of that. But I think we ultimately know that if you get that wrong, many of the other things, education, health, don't come with it. This was the site as it was seen in 2005. We were awarded in 2007 for the 2012 Games. We don't have really time to go through it in detail, but the most important thing is that you see a large lump of empty land, ex-railway yards, cut off from the surroundings. You can see a lot of green, a network of canals and parks which leads up to the north and connects down to the river, which is at the bottom of the slide. It's also an area which has a sort of industrial sort of feel about it, in a way quite beautiful, a bit polluted when this picture was taken. I wouldn't want to swim there, but you can see what's on top. Telephone and telegraph pole and electricity poles. In our countries, we don't build under these structures. In India and elsewhere in Africa, one does. So the first thing that actually happened was to use a large chunk of money, and I'll show you that in a second, in order to sort of get rid of those pylons. The other thing to bear in mind, and this is very redolent, I think, in this city, is the fact that the surrounding communities on the left, right, top, and bottom of that other slide I showed you are some of the richest, newest waves of immigrants, but have been there for about 100, 150 years, and then new ones are coming in from every single part of the world. Very vibrant part of London, but it also was literally a dump. I'm not inventing the term. My fridge, somewhere there, most of Londoners' fridges ended up here. Think of the problem that actually this creates in terms of pollution on the ground. Remember this image, I'll come back to it. The first 500 million euros was used to get rid of these pylons and create a whole new sort of system below ground so that you can actually create a piece of city. This is, in a series of very quick images, the master plan. And then I'll show you, to conclude, some slides of what it's like. Here's the site. The mayor basically bought it, and it became public land. I told you that there's nice canals, there's a sort of green, so why not make it a park with water? There are hardly any connections, or were any connections at that point, because it was industrial land, actually quite dangerous to go to, so a lot of money was used on creating 38 different connections, bridges, underpasses, and many other things. Put housing and jobs next to where there's public transport, and only build what you need, and keep it there for long term, and all the other things are temporary. Strangely, London didn't have a velodrome, didn't have an aquatic center, so we built those permanently, and all the other facilities were completely sort of temporary. This is probably the most important, very boring slide I'm going to show you, which shows that once you've taken away those stars, once you've got rid of all the temporary stuff, you actually have platforms for urban integrated development. And that's exactly what the project is about. Without going into detail again, all you need to see, and anyway, most of you at the back of the room can't see the detail, it feels like a mixed piece, rather messy, rather organic London. And that very much is the plan over the next 20, 30 years, not unlike bits that we all know. Now, I mentioned the dump. That's a view of what the dump became in 7 years. So actually quite a beautiful public space. In a few days, a year, we do even get warm enough that in London people lie outside. This actually happened. And this was in an area where there were no sports facilities, and this now literally belongs to anyone who lives in the neighborhood. These are some of the good news stories. Everything was designed to be retrofitted. That's the term that I want to hang on to. 200,000 people went around spaces like that. You need very, very wide bridges. This is a picture during construction. Everything was done, as I say, to be then reduced down. So the white is permanent, but the light brown actually was then taken away to have a decent size sort of bridge. So the attention to detail was significant. Buildings that we didn't really need, we don't play basketball, we're not tall enough in the UK, was actually demounted and the material sold on. The very beautiful swimming pool designed by Zaha Hadid, one of the great architects based in London, was designed to look like this. It was never seen like that. It was like that. And why? Because we actually had 17,000 seats to sell. It's the most popular sport at the beginning of the Olympics. And it's been retrofitted to this, I think, rather beautiful structure. Now for 3 to 4 euros a day, you can actually swim in this extraordinary pool. We have made some horrible mistakes. I think one of the most interesting things that we've been able to actually do in terms of making a piece is to provide housing. This was the Olympic Village in a low-end, low-value part of the city. Let me stress that. You saw where it was. The Qatari DR, the Royal Family Investment Fund, has bought half of this estate for 650 million pounds, nearly €1 billion. But 50% of it actually remains for affordable housing. They've rebranded it East Village because it's cool, right? And the values of property have gone up enormously. And this is actually what's being built, very reminiscent in many ways of what the public spaces of London are like. A park is now open to the public. This is what it looked like last summer. A very decent place to go. And the story in many ways continues. It's an evolving story. One can't think of urban design and urban development as a sort of static moment in history, particularly not over 2 weeks. So our current mayor, Boris Johnson, who speaks Latin, came up with this term, which I can't even pronounce, right? But it's basically a sort of cultural hub in the middle of the city, of the area right in front of the aquatic center that you've seen there. And this competition was awarded only a few days ago, in fact, in London. And the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is a major museum, we heard talk earlier today about that, 2 major universities, a dance center, and the Smithsonian from Washington are actually moving new facilities to there. Whoever would have thought that a few years ago? And this is the only image available of that new project. So, in rethinking, one sort of gets into the notion of changing a city and trying to do it well. I think there are 3 or 4 key principles. The first thing is think of time. Think of the notion of actually change in a sort of subtle and organic way rather than changing things by rupture. That's what it was like in 2005. This is what it was like in 2012. And this is an image of what that area might be like in 5 or 10 years from now. Probably more importantly is to think of it as a piece of a jigsaw of how the whole dynamic, the whole DNA of the city is changing at the social, the spatial, and the sort of physical level. In fact, what you'll see here in red is the bit of the Olympics, which is only part of now this much wider sort of jigsaw of change across the whole of East London. So, going back and beginning to conclude, was it worth spending 18 billion euros? Well, Oxford Economics, which is a consultancy based in a minor university somewhere, has actually calculated that since the Games, we've actually contributed 6 billion euros a year in taxes and other contributions to the UK economy. So you could say that in a matter of 3 or 4 years, you actually repay that bet. It's not that simple, but the most important thing is to use the market and the public to have these longer-term legacies, which also requires the institutions, not just the spatial programs that I described, to make a lasting piece of city. So good luck to you in Hamburg. Thank you very much.